We're about a month away from the expansion draft. The Seattle Kraken are, they're deciding who they might be taking for their first roster in the NHL. And the Vancouver Canucks have an interesting situation ahead of the expansion draft. Unlike other teams, maybe their protected list isn't as full as it would be around the NHL, but still interesting to see how it's going to play out. Randip, what do you think the Canucks do with their protected list?
Okay, the list, you're right. It's not the most thorough across the league. I'll definitely say that. But you do have some players that, let's go through the 7 forwards and 3D kind of options, because that's the option that I see Vancouver taking. You've got Elias Pettersson, Bo Horvat, Brock Besser, JT Miller, Tanner Pearson. And this is where it gets interesting. Tyler Mott, yes, you're looking at that and saying, wait a second, a bottom 6 forward, Tyler Mott. He's been important to the Vancouver Canucks, and he's a guy that I would have on that list. I think that's pretty much a certainty. Most lists will have that. Beyond that, it kind of gets a little murky. Probably going to go with a younger player eligible to be a rookie next year, Cole Lind, who has been playing at the AHL, had a great year in the AHL, but that's where you're occupying that 7th player is probably somebody with minimal experience. And I would say at this point in time, you probably got a Cole Lind that you would put there because he's got that potential to move up the lineup. When we're looking at defensemen, it's pretty simple. Tyler Myers, Nate Schmidt, and Olli Juolevi, who is along the same lines as a Cole Lind, where you haven't seen much at the NHL level, but it speaks to, I guess, the lack of depth the Vancouver Canucks have. And this is a positive come this time of the year, because you can actually be a little bit aggressive and try to occupy those roles. But those are my, I guess, 10 players, in addition to the goalie, which we know is Thatcher Demko. And I would probably say Braden Holtby's that player that you say, hey, Seattle, if you want to take, go for it. But that is my list, Dan. Pettersson, Horvat, Besser, Miller, Pearson, Mott, and Lind. And on the defensive side of things, Myers, Schmidt, Olli Juolevi.
Yeah, and it's, again, that's a list that it's pretty obvious who they are going to take. Maybe that 7th forward could be a Matthew Highmore instead, Jonah Gadjevich maybe, but Zach McEwen. But there's just not a lot of names that the Canucks would worry too much or lose sleep over potentially losing for free. Now, if you were to go the other way and just protect 8 skaters, I don't see a scenario where this really makes a ton of sense for the Vancouver Canucks because of the list that they already have. The only way that this maybe becomes a conversation is we know they're negotiating with Alex Edler and Travis Hamonic, and they, at least, there's some positive thoughts that those contracts may be able to get signed and those defensemen will return to Vancouver for next year. But I would imagine if they are going to re-sign those players, they don't really officially announce those until after the expansion draft. At least that would make the most sense for the Vancouver Canucks to do something like that. So the 4-4 or the 8 skaters, I just don't see it being realistic for the Canucks. They definitely will go with the 7 forwards and 3D. Now, the other thing about this, though, as we talk about it, Randy, it's definitely a list that can be upgraded. So if you're Jim Benning, what are you looking to do before that July 17th mini trade deadline, I guess, when rosters get frozen ahead of the expansion draft?
I think a priority for Jim Benning has to be getting either a young forward or a young D. And we're talking about players with control that would be able to hit RFA status. So you're not looking for a veteran. You're not looking for a mid-career player. I'm looking at maybe that, 22 to 24 range. Is there a player that you can trade for that would give you some value, give you some runway before they really have to get paid? And to me, I think the area that the Canucks need to address, defense is something that we've talked about at length, even in these videos as well, and on our radio show in Vancouver, the People Show. But I think this past year, the Canucks got found out for their forward depth. They didn't have much of anything. They were trying options in their top 6 that had no business being in the top 6. So to me, you're looking at priorities on what should be addressed, what should be aggressively pursued in the lead up to the expansion draft, and take advantage of teams that potentially could be, have too many forwards. I'm looking at that position, especially on the wings. You can even hopefully try to get a center/winger. And one player that I'm looking at is going to be in the Central Division next year, back to the normal divisions, is Minnesota's got some decisions to make. And one of the players I'd be looking at is a Jordan Greenway. This is a guy that's young. He's a big physical player. Every year he's gotten better. He can play in that bottom six very effectively. He's been one of the better players in that role for the Minnesota Wild. And the best thing is he's still in that range where you're going to have control over this player. You're going to get him at a cheap price. So players like that I look at for the Canucks, because you need impact players on the wings right now. And to me, Jordan Greenway is a classic example of that, a guy that can upgrade the Canucks roster, and you're not paying that much to get him.
Yeah, I think Minnesota is super interesting in that, depending on what they do, maybe Matt Dumba even becomes available. He's a couple of years out from free agency, and they have Jared Spurgeon that they have to protect. They have Ryan Suter that they have to protect. Jonas Brodin as well. So they could go the 7-3, or they could go with the 8 skaters. But Matt Dumba might become available in trade. Because of that, we know he's been in a lot of trade rumors before and in the last couple of years as well. But I think defense, you look at the Final Four teams, Randip, and all of those teams, and we see it every year in the Stanley Cup playoffs, they are just loaded on D. And it's one area that the Canucks absolutely have to think about upgrading, even if they are keeping Alex Edler around. They have to find, a solution, a succession to Alex Edler, who's been a stalwart for the Canucks for more than a decade now. But Quinn Hughes is exempt. Tyler Myers, you've got to find a way to upgrade back there. And there's more defensemen that are going to become available in the expansion draft because of the protection situations. So I think that's really the area where Jim Benning can target, as he keeps saying he's going to be aggressive. Well, why don't you go over to Carolina and get aggressive on Jake Bean? That's a young defenseman who's shown really well in the last couple of years and has been developed slowly because Carolina's loaded on defense and they just haven't had a big role for him. So he's had that time to really mature. We know he's been a big part of Canadian programs earlier in his career. So I really think Jake Bean on the left side of D would be the name that I look for the Canucks to go out and target.
Okay, you're thinking Alex Edler's succession plan. Another player that has been talked about, I'm sure the Canucks, among other teams, have maybe thought about this player, is Eric Chernak in Tampa Bay as well. That's another team that is going to have to make some very difficult decisions on what they do. Is there a price that you can meet if you're the Canucks to hit that? Because defensively, yes, they do have some issues, but I go back to the winger position. I just think their lack of depth there really showed last year. You need guys that can make an impact and play that pro game. So Jim Benning has some decisions to make. Maybe he'll make a decision on both of those, whether it's via trade before the expansion draft or free agency. But I think we can both agree there's some holes to fill in the Canucks roster.
Yeah, there definitely is a lot of work for Jim Benning to do. And I said it in an earlier video, I consider it a failure of the offseason if the Canucks don't find a way to upgrade their protected list ahead of the expansion draft. There is opportunity there, and if they say they are going to be aggressive, well, they have to exploit that advantage they may have on some teams that are overfull, that are have a surplus to requirements when it comes to their protected lists. Who do you think the Canucks should be targeting in trade ahead of the expansion draft? And is there a name that we left out that you think they should be protecting? Let us know in the comments. Subscribe, leave a review. We appreciate it, and we'll see you in the next video.